Welcome to Galactic Atlas Lore. If you enjoy these tales, please like and subscribe. If you have any recommendations you would like me to explore, please leave a comment. Let's begin. The Rise of the Rebellion, the Alliance. Chapter 1. Embers of Resistance. In the smouldering aftermath of the Clone Wars, the galaxy did not erupt in celebration. There were no grand parades to mark the war's end. Only silence, fatigue, and a tightening grip on liberty. The newly formed Galactic Empire emerged from the dying embers of the Republic like a shadow stretching across the stars. It was swift, calculating, and masked in the language of peace and order. Most citizens, weary of battle and chaos, welcomed the firm hand of Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, now self-declared Emperor, with cautious optimism. But there were some who saw beneath the surface. Palpatine's rise was not born from adoration, but from manipulation. Through Order 66, he had extinguished the Jedi, those who once stood as guardians of democracy. He declared them traitors to the Republic, plotting to overthrow the Senate. And with the Jedi gone, nothing stood between Palpatine and unchecked dominion. The Galactic Senate, hollowed by fear and misinformation, ratified his rule. The Grand Army of the Republic, rebranded as the Imperial Military, now answered to a single voice. Yet in those first quiet days, as the banners of the Republic were stripped down from government halls and replaced with imperial crests, small tremors of dissent began to ripple through the political class. Bail Organa, senator of Alderaan and a veteran of the Clone Wars political theatre, had long harbored suspicions about the Chancellor's increasing authority. Alongside Mon Mothma of Chandrila and Ghorman Massacre of Corellia, he formed an unspoken alliance. Three minds joined by duty, not ideology. They came from very different worlds. Organa, noble and measured, sought to preserve institutions through diplomacy. Mothma, fiery and eloquent, understood the necessity of systemic overhaul. And Massacre, ever the pragmatist, carried the grit and paranoia of someone who had seen tyranny ferment in the cracks of Republic law. Their personalities clashed often, but their purpose did not. They saw the writing on the walls long before most others. The Republic was not transforming, it was dying. Despite their shared awareness, the time for open rebellion had not yet come. The early years of the Empire were marked by a subtle suppression of freedoms. Planetary governors, appointed directly by Palpatine, replaced local senatorial authority. The Imperial Security Bureau was established, quietly to monitor sedition and disorder. Holonet broadcasts shifted in tone. Words like safety, loyalty, and unification began to appear with unnerving regularity, often accompanied by veiled warnings. Dissident voices disappeared or were brought into silence. Yet in the dark, small lights began to flicker, tiny resistances that would eventually coalesce into something greater. It began not with starfleets, but with whispers. On planets like Ryloth, enslaved populations who had fought against the Separatists during the Clone Wars were now forced under imperial yokes. Twi'lek freedom fighters, once celebrated, were now hunted. Chum Syndulla, a war hero during the Clone Wars, turned guerrilla commander, refusing to bend the knee. His resistance group, the Free Ryloth Movement, was not yet aligned with any galactic rebellion, but it was a sign. The Empire's promise of peace was not universal. Elsewhere, on Ghorman, a mid-rim world known for its pacifism, a far different protest began. When imperial policies began strangling planetary trade and depleting natural resources, citizens staged sit-ins on the landing pads. It was peaceful, symbolic. But Captain Tarkin, already gaining influence within the imperial hierarchy, saw such dissent as dangerous. He ordered a shuttle to land, regardless of the crowd beneath it. Dozens were crushed. The Ghorman Massacre was sanitized in imperial media, but the truth spread in hushed tones among senators and activists. For Mon Mothma, it was the final spark. Though she remained within the Senate, her loyalty to the Empire was shattered. Amid these growing fractures, a critical moment unfolded quietly and without media coverage: the delegation of 2000. This group of senators, led unofficially by Bail Organa, Mon Mothma, and Padme Amidala of Naboo, drafted a petition to Chancellor Palpatine expressing grave concerns over his accumulation of emergency powers and the disappearance of senatorial oversight. Their language was cautious, not inflammatory. They did not demand resignation or revolution, only accountability. The petition was never formally acknowledged. Padme Amidala would die shortly after its delivery, under suspicious circumstances tied to the collapse of Mustafar and the birth of the Emperor's dark apprentice. But the delegation had done something irreversible. It had placed names on a list. Palpatine never forgot those names. In the years following, many signatories would find themselves targeted. Some disappeared, others were framed in corruption scandals, and a few simply retired under pressure. But Bail Organa and Mon Mothma remained in the Senate, shielded, perhaps, by public stature or political leverage, but never safe. Still, they worked from within, forging clandestine communications with other disillusioned senators and planetary governors. Slowly, they began to weave a network. Careful, decentralized, and deniable. This web of resistors did not yet call itself an alliance. In truth, it was little more than a scattered collection of sympathetic groups and rebellious cells, but they shared a purpose: to undermine imperial expansion. Some provided intelligence, others smuggled supplies to oppressed worlds. A few, like the insurgents of Riloth or the human-led freighters operating from Salost, took direct military action. Each acted independently, but over time they began to converge. The role of planetary culture in this resistance cannot be overstated. Chandrala, home of Mon Mothma, had long nurtured a tradition of democratic purity. Its citizens were raised on the ideals of civic duty and galactic cooperation. While not a militaristic world, its universities became breeding grounds for dissident philosophy, and its shipping fleets quietly funneled resources to sympathetic groups under the guise of trade. Alderaan, meanwhile, was a jewel of the core worlds. With its rich cultural heritage and deep commitment to pacifism, it became a symbolic center of hope and civilization. Bail Organa ensured that its diplomatic missions extended beyond protocol. They became couriers for information, funds, and people. He used Alderaan's prestige to mask covert operations, providing shelter to persecuted beings and Jedi survivors when no one else dared. It was on Alderaan that the early seeds of an organized rebellion were watered, even if they had not yet sprouted. Darm Beliblis, operating from Corellia, was less subtle. Though still officially a senator, he funneled personal wealth into arming local militias and securing trade routes free from imperial interference. Corellia's shipyards, some of the most advanced in the galaxy, quietly lost shipments that would later appear in rebel hands. Beliblis distrusted central authority, even among his fellow resistors, but he understood that imperial domination would reach even Corellia in time. He prepared accordingly. By the 5th year of the Empire's rule, these flickers of rebellion had begun to find one another. The Phoenix Cell rose on the outer rim. Smugglers like Jan Dodona, Garrick Face Loran, and Bria Tharen began operating with purpose. The idea of rebellion had moved from fantasy to plan, and yet it was still fragile. A single misstep could unravel it all. The Empire had eyes everywhere, and its response to dissent was swift and brutal. Still, the dissenters pressed forward. Though they would not form a true alliance for some years yet, the triangle of Bail Organa, Mon Mothma, and Gum Bail Bliss served as the moral and strategic heart of what was to come. Each carried a piece of the rebellion's soul: hope, defiance, and action. They laid the groundwork in hidden halls, whispered meetings, and encoded transmissions. Their resistance did not yet have a name, but its heartbeat had begun, and as more systems slipped beneath the Empire's control and more citizens woke to the reality of imperial rule, the embers of resistance glowed ever brighter. In the vastness of the galaxy, A storm was forming, silent, patient, inevitable. The rebellion had not yet risen, but it was no longer just a dream. It was beginning. Chapter 2: Sparks on Ghorman. In the grand timeline of galactic history, the incident on Ghorman was a footnote to some, a minor planetary protest turned tragic. But for those who stood against the Empire, it was a turning point. It did not birth the rebellion outright, but it stripped away illusions. It showed the galaxy that the Empire's commitment to order was not bound by morality, that its brand of peace could crush the innocent without remorse. Ghorman, a world known more for its quiet commerce than for political unrest, would become synonymous with martyrdom, a name etched into the foundations of resistance. Situated in the CERN sector of the Mid-Rim, Ghorman was a tranquil planet, inhabited largely by a pacifist population known for its democratic traditions and peaceful protests. It was not militarized nor particularly rebellious. Its people had once welcomed the Republic and even tolerated the transition to the Empire, assuming that their world, remote and politically neutral, would remain unaffected. But imperial policy spared no planet, no matter how docile. When regional resource taxation intensified and hyperspace lanes were restructured under direct imperial control, Ghorman's economy suffered dramatically. Small merchants went bankrupt, entire trade routes were suspended or redirected through more loyal sectors. Supplies grew scarce. With no recourse in the Senate and their local government stripped of power by a newly appointed imperial governor, the people of Ghorman turned to protest. It began as a sit-in, a passive resistance where civilians occupied the main landing pad of the local starport, preventing any incoming or outgoing traffic. It was non-violent, symbolic. Families gathered with banners, children sat with their elders. The goal was to be seen, not to obstruct commerce, but to demand dialogue. Imperial authorities were notified well in advance. They expected a confrontation. What no one expected was the arrival of Captain Wilhuff Tarkin. Tarkin at the time was an ambitious officer within the Imperial Navy, recently elevated due to his brutal efficiency during the pacification of the Seswena sector. He had begun crafting his philosophy of control, a belief that fear of force rather than the use of force itself was the surest path to compliance. But on Ghorman, he decided to act. Viewing the protest as a direct challenge to imperial authority, he refused to recognize the legitimacy of the demonstration. He ordered his shuttle to land directly on the occupied pad. Despite warnings from local advisors and the desperate pleas of the starport control officers, Tarkin pressed forward. The shuttle descended with mechanical indifference, and those who did not flee were caught beneath it. Dozens were killed instantly. More were maimed by the thruster wash or the violent dispersal that followed as stormtroopers sealed the area. No shots were fired, but the message was clear. The Empire would not be negotiated with. The deaths were framed as an unfortunate accident, a result of reckless civilian disobedience. Mon Mothma, already deeply disillusioned by the Ghorman blockade and Palpatine's consolidation of power, was devastated. She had received news of the protests' planning through her contacts and had hoped to intervene diplomatically. The massacre arrived on her datapad as a cold imperial report, brief, sanitized, and cruelly efficient. It described the resolution of an unauthorized civilian disruption with minimal loss of life, but the unedited footage, smuggled out by a local port worker, showed a different story. She watched it in silence. The shuttle's slow descent, the screaming, the sudden chaos. When the recording ended, she no longer believed that change could come from within the Senate. That day, Mon Mothma began to plan for war. The Senate chamber remained silent on the subject. No formal investigation was launched. Emperor Palpatine did not address the event publicly. When Mothma attempted to raise the incident, her request was denied under the pretext of pending regional security assessments. Bail Organa, seated beside her during the session, noted the look in her eyes, not sorrow, but resolve. Ghorman had not just claimed innocent lives, it had severed her final thread of faith in the imperial system. She would not walk out of the chamber that day as a senator. She would walk out as a revolutionary. Across the galaxy, Ghorman's tragedy stirred unrest in quiet places. Small mining colonies whispered of the massacre in hushed tones. Local leaders on worlds like Gorse, Lothal, and Sullust began re-evaluating their position. Many had already suffered under economic hardship, but now they saw what awaited them if they dared to protest. In response, the Empire ramped up its media control. Holonet broadcasts were scrubbed. Even the word Ghorman was flagged in communications. But suppression only bred suspicion, and silence only amplified the whispers. This was the moment that gave rise to a new breed of resistance. Not soldiers, not senators, but truth-tellers. Underground news networks, long considered obsolete in a galaxy saturated with Holonet propaganda, began to re-emerge. One of the first was the Free Voice of the Rim, a pirate broadcast transmitted from an old separatist satellite hidden in the Rishi Maze. Its hosts, anonymous former journalists and disillusioned droids, aired intercepted imperial memos, censored testimonies, and reconstructed footage from events like Ghorman. They had no face, no base, and no leader, but their voice spread. Another figure emerged. Calliope Shen, a former intelligence analyst turned whistleblower, leaked a classified report detailing the full extent of Tarkin's Ghorman operation. Her name was never officially acknowledged, but within the rebellion's growing intelligence circles, she was revered. Her actions gave weight to the claims, providing the concrete data that exposed the cover-up. Through her work, the term Ghorman Massacre became more than rumor. It became truth. Rebel propaganda, still in its infancy, found in Ghorman a rallying cry. The image of civilians sitting peacefully, unarmed, and then crushed under the Empire's heel became a symbol. Reproduced on leaflets, posters, even graffiti scrawled on city walls in Lower Coruscant and across the Outer Rim. A single silhouette, an adult holding the hand of a child seated on a landing pad, became iconic. Artists reimagined it endlessly. Poets composed elegies. Musicians smuggled out rebel ballads that told Ghorman's story to factory workers and moisture farmers. Mon Mothma, now operating in shadow with Bail Organa and Garm Bel Iblis, began leveraging Ghorman as a case study in her covert conversations with other senators and planetary leaders. She would not speak of it openly in the Senate again, but in coded messages and secret meetings she referenced it as proof of the Empire's brutality. The Ghorman incident became a litmus test. If a contact dismissed it, they were not to be trusted. If they recognized its weight, they were welcomed into the growing network of dissent. Captain Tarkin, meanwhile, suffered no reprimand. In fact, he was promoted. The Empire rewarded efficiency, and Ghorman proved that fear could quiet a planet. His methods would eventually evolve into what became known as the Tarkin Doctrine, the belief that rule through terror, not justice, was the most effective means of control. That doctrine would echo across the stars, eventually shaping the rationale behind the Death Star itself. To Tarkin, Ghorman was not a failure, it was a prototype. But for the rebellion, it was something more. Ghorman's fallen were not forgotten. They were not numbers nor nameless victims. Within the rebellion's early culture, they were honored. The first stealth corvette to join the Alliance fleet was named the Ghorman Light. Training programs invoked their memory as a reminder of what the rebellion stood against. Recruits were told, "This is why we fight." So no other world must suffer Ghorman's fate. Even years later, when the rebellion was a formal military, commanders used the Ghorman footage as a primer for new intelligence officers, proof that the Empire's mask could not be trusted. Ghorman's legacy extended even into strategy. Rebel cells began using passive protests and sit-ins not only as symbols of resistance, but as traps, to lure Imperial responses and film them for broadcast. The hope was never that these protests would win battles, but that they would expose the Empire's true nature to those still undecided. In this, Ghorman had provided a blueprint, not just for injustice, but for propaganda warfare. The Empire, for all its strength, could not kill an idea, and Ghorman had become one. In time, Mon Mothma would speak publicly again, years later, in a message broadcast to the entire galaxy when she formally declared rebellion. In that speech, she named Ghorman first among the Empire's atrocities. Her voice, clear and unwavering, carried across systems. For some, it was the first time they had ever heard of the incident. For others, it was a vindication, and for the Empire, it was a warning. What began as a quiet protest on a backwater world had become something far larger. It had ignited flames in forgotten corners of the galaxy. It had turned civilians into saboteurs, bureaucrats into smugglers, and senators into rebels. Ghorman, with all its silence and sorrow, had not died in vain. It had sparked the fire. Chapter 3: The Partisan Divide. The war for freedom did not begin with a unified banner or a noble creed. It began in fragments, in pockets of defiance scattered across the stars, each shaped by its own scars. Among these was a figure whose legacy would split the rebel cause as much as it would inspire it. His name was Gerrera. To some he was a hero, to others a fanatic, but none could deny that Saw's path carved a new face of resistance, one born not of diplomacy or restraint, but of desperation, vengeance, and fire. Saw Gerrera's war began long before the Galactic Empire. It began on the jungle world of Onderon during the Clone Wars. A separatist puppet king had seized control, backed by droid armies, and the native population was divided. While many chose compliance, others resisted. Gerrera, a brash and unrelenting young man, joined a small insurgent group under the leadership of his sister, Steela. Their unit conducted guerrilla operations deep in the wilderness, sabotaging supply lines, ambushing patrols, disappearing into the jungle before retaliation could land. It was Steela, calm and charismatic, who held the group together with vision and discipline. Saw brought the rage. The Jedi, sensing the strategic importance of Onderon, provided covert support. Anakin Skywalker, Ahsoka Tano, and Obi-Wan Kenobi trained the insurgents in tactics, provided equipment, and helped them coordinate strikes. For Saw, the Jedi were both mentors and tools. He respected their power, but never fully trusted their code. His focus remained singular: liberation through force. When Steela died in the final push to retake the capital, falling from a cliff during a firefight, something in Saw broke. He had fought for freedom, but it had cost him the only person who could temper his anger. From that day, his operations took on a different tone, harsher, less discriminating. The cause remained, but the humanity frayed. The Republic's victory on Onderon was recorded as a tactical success, a footnote in the broader war. For Saw Gerrera, it was the beginning of a life defined by resistance and sacrifice. Years later, as the Galactic Empire tightened its grip, Gerrera resurfaced on various worlds, always in shadow, always in conflict. He never returned to Onderon. He carried its memory like a wound, using it to justify every brutal choice that followed. While the alliance to restore the Republic began forming behind the scenes through careful diplomacy and coordinated logistics, Gerrera founded the Partisans, a militant faction that operated independently of the broader rebel effort. The Partisans were not subtle. They bombed Imperial convoys, assassinated planetary governors, raided secure facilities, and in some cases placed civilian lives at risk. They were mobile, secretive, and fanatically loyal to Saw. He operated from hidden bases on planets like Jeddah, Geonosis, and Selos, gathering displaced peoples, former soldiers, and those too disillusioned or angry for standard rebellion politics. His cells were small and hard to track, often splintering and reforming based on necessity. His messages, when recorded, carried the harsh tone of finality. The Empire must be destroyed at any cost. To Mon Mothma and the Alliance High Command, Saw Gerrera posed a moral dilemma. They respected his resolve but feared his methods. His willingness to strike civilian targets or execute suspected collaborators contradicted the values the Alliance wished to project. Mothma, Organa and Dodonna envisioned a rebellion that could stand for hope and legitimacy, one that would be supported, not feared, by the common people. Gerrera's tactics made that impossible. The rift grew wider after an incident on the world of Inusagi, where the Partisans detonated an explosive in an Imperial garrison. The target was legitimate, but the blast spread to a nearby civilian housing district. Dozens of non-combatants were killed, and holo recordings captured the chaos. The Empire leveraged the footage, using it in anti-rebel broadcasts to frame all dissenters as terrorists. Mothma confronted Saw in a rare face-to-face meeting. It ended in shouting. Saw accused her of weakness. She accused him of becoming what he fought against. From that point forward, the Partisans were officially disavowed by the Alliance, yet they were never actively hunted. There remained a grudging acknowledgement that Gerrera's war, however brutal, tied up Imperial forces, distracted attention and made room for quieter rebel victories. He was, in effect, a weapon the Alliance refused to claim, but could not afford to discard. The line between freedom fighter and terrorist blurred further in the Outer Rim. On the moon of Jeddah, a sacred site for many Force believers, Saw's presence grew increasingly volatile. He established a hidden base in the catacombs beneath the Holy City, recruiting from among the displaced pilgrims and smugglers who had come to oppose the Empire's occupation. Jeddah became a powder keg, and Gerrera was the match. It was here that his legacy took root in new ways. Among those who passed through his ranks were young fighters who would later join or influence other rebel factions. A lieutenant named Edrio Two Tubes, a Tognaf warrior, became a legend among guerrilla fighters. Others, like Starvan and Bisa Fortuna, carried partisan tactics to distant worlds, teaching sabotage and urban warfare to newer cells. Even the Phoenix Cell, one of the earliest organized rebel units, adopted techniques pioneered by Saw, especially in the use of hit-and-run assaults, intelligence sabotage, and psychological warfare. On Lothal, a small group of insurgents led by former Jedi Kanan Jarrus and the young Ezra Bridger employed similar asymmetric tactics. While they did not share Saw's ruthlessness, the influence was evident. Disruption over confrontation, destruction of key infrastructure, the use of coded broadcasts to inspire resistance. The difference was restraint. Kanan tempered aggression with compassion. Ezra sought to save lives, not just win battles, but the roots traced back to Underon. Even Ahsoka Tano, once Saw's teacher, acknowledged his influence. Operating under the code name Fulcrum, she used her network to support cells like Phoenix Squadron and the Lothal insurgents. She often acted as a bridge between the Alliance and fringe fighters like the Partisans, quietly ensuring intelligence flowed even when diplomacy had failed. In private, she mourned what Saw had become. In public, she ensured his efforts were not wasted. Gerrera's philosophy lived on in his doctrine. The Empire recognizes only strength, and diplomacy is a luxury of the naive. He believed that totalitarianism must be fought with uncompromising resistance, but the galaxy was not so binary. In the shadows, Saw's operatives sometimes turned to extortion, intimidation, and paranoia. He became increasingly isolated, consumed by fear of betrayal. His health deteriorated. Breathing masks, cybernetic limbs, and implanted monitors kept his broken body functional. His mind, however, remained sharp and fixated on the Empire's destruction. When questioned about civilian deaths, he would answer with bitterness, "The Empire has killed billions. Spare me the lectures on collateral damage." To his followers, this was clarity. To the Alliance, it was poison. And yet, there were missions where the Alliance quietly redirected intelligence towards Saw, knowing he would do what they could not. It was a hypocrisy, but one born of necessity. Saw Gerrera's final years were spent chasing a ghost. He believed the Empire was building something monstrous. On Geonosis, he found the skeletal remains of massive structures, entire hives sterilized by Imperial forces. He spoke of a superweapon, a planet killer. Most dismissed him. The Alliance had heard rumors but lacked proof. Saw had no such patience for evidence. He hunted leads obsessively, tortured informants, and sent operatives to die chasing whispers. In his eyes, the Empire's greatest sin had yet to be revealed, and he would uncover it or die trying. In time, he did. Though his life ended before the full truth of the Death Star reached the galaxy, his relentless pursuit laid the groundwork for others to uncover the project known as Stardust. His obsession brought Bodhi Rook, a defecting Imperial pilot, into contact with rebel informants. It seeded doubt in the minds of Imperial technicians. His paranoia, though costly, proved prescient. Within the Alliance, Gerrera remained a contentious figure even after death. His tactics were never adopted officially. His name was rarely spoken in high command briefings. Yet his influence was undeniable. He had exposed the moral contradictions at the heart of rebellion. He had shown that purity was a luxury and victory might require blood. Future rebel leaders would wrestle with his legacy. Cassian Andor, a spy and saboteur, embodied that internal struggle, forced to commit acts he could not justify to himself, haunted by the question, where is the line? Princess Leia, Mon Mothma, and General Dodona would reaffirm the rebellion's commitment to justice, but they could never deny that Gerrera's fire had burned the path forward. Saw Gerrera was not the rebellion, but he was its shadow, its rage, its fear, its raw and terrible will to survive. In the end, his life was a warning and a weapon. The Empire had created him, and in doing so, it had sown a fury that no negotiation could ever tame. The partisan divide did not break the rebellion, but it forced it to choose what kind of revolution it would be. That choice, and the balance between righteousness and ruthlessness, would echo across every battle that followed. Chapter 4. Secret Wars and Hidden Cells. The war against the Empire was not always waged with fleets and armies. Long before the rebellion assembled its first star cruiser or broadcast its first declaration, there was another kind of warfare, a silent struggle of secrets, sabotage, and survival. It was a war fought in alleys and across encrypted channels, in the shadows of outer rim ports and the bowels of data networks. It was in this clandestine crucible that the earliest coordinated rebel efforts emerged, not as a singular movement, but as a scattered chorus of hidden cells, each operating independently, each at risk of annihilation if discovered. Yet one such group would come to represent the tip of the spear, Phoenix Cell. Commander Jun Sato was not a household name across the galaxy. He was no senator or nobleman, no charismatic leader paraded on propaganda hollows. But among the early rebel operatives, his reputation was formidable. A career officer from Mikapur, Sato had served in the Republic Navy before watching his world fall under Imperial domination. Rather than submit or retreat into obscurity, he took what resources he could, ships, personnel, knowledge, and went underground. From that place of exile he formed Phoenix Cell, a mobile resistance unit dedicated to hit-and-run strikes, rescue missions, and intelligence gathering. He was not flamboyant, nor did he seek credit, but he understood strategy, loyalty, and the long game. Operating primarily from a fleet of modified blockade runners and corvettes, Phoenix Cell carved out a small but significant theater of resistance. Their targets were not major military outposts or sector commands. Instead, they focused on vulnerability, Imperial depots with lax security, prisoner transport convoys, communications relays. Their precision strikes disrupted local control, sowed doubt in Imperial garrisons, and bolstered civilian morale. But even Sato knew that firepower alone would not bring down an empire. Information would be the true weapon. That weapon came in the form of a codename: Fulcrum. Fulcrum was not a person, at first. It was a signal, a voice distorted through layers of encryption, providing intelligence to scattered cells with no centralized command. Fulcrum knew things: Imperial fleet movements, upcoming arrests, station vulnerabilities. Many suspected it was a defector from within the Empire. Few guessed the truth. Fulcrum was Ahsoka Tano. Once a Jedi Padawan to Anakin Skywalker, Ahsoka had left the Jedi Order during the Clone Wars, disillusioned by its political entanglements. She survived Order 66 through anonymity, burying her identity and resurfacing years later to support the burgeoning resistance. Her experience with the Jedi, the clones, and the Republic had given her a unique understanding of how the Empire operated and how it could be undermined. Using her Fulcrum persona, she became a conduit between isolated rebel groups, offering guidance, intelligence, and strategic coordination without ever revealing her true identity. It was through Fulcrum that Phoenix Cell connected with various other operations across the galaxy. She helped arrange supply exchanges between rebel-friendly smugglers and refugee routes out of enslaved systems. She brokered communications between cells that, until then, had believed they were alone. Most importantly, she preserved the illusion of coordination without centralization. If one group was discovered, it would not compromise the others. Fulcrum's network relied heavily on slicers, specialists who could infiltrate, manipulate, and reroute Imperial data systems. These were not traditional soldiers. They were technicians, former information brokers, and in some cases, reprogrammed droids. One of the most renowned slicers was Kest Dameron, a former Holonet engineer who turned whistleblower after witnessing mass censorship campaigns. He created a decentralized protocol for data duplication, allowing rebel cells to extract and transmit stolen files across dozens of systems without detection. Through his methods, Fulcrum and others acquired encrypted logs, ship manifests, and surveillance records that were otherwise locked behind Imperial firewalls. Saboteurs played their part as well, agents who specialized in destruction with purpose. These operatives learned the rhythms of Imperial logistics. They infiltrated factories to damage starfighter fuel lines, altered construction blueprints on star destroyers, and planted malware in navigational arrays that would cause fleets to arrive late or off course. Their victories were rarely flashy, a shipment lost here, a delay there, but collectively, these delays began to frustrate Imperial command, create tension among officers, and give the rebellion space to breathe. And yet, none of this could function without the lifeblood of the underground, smuggling. Enter Chikatro Vizago, a Deveronian with a criminal record as long as a Star Destroyer's hull. Vizago operated out of Lotal and surrounding sectors, running weapons, stolen tech, and fugitives in and out of Imperial territory under the cover of mercantile enterprise. His allegiance was not to the rebellion but to profit. Still, he found that aiding rebel operatives, particularly when there were Imperial bounties involved, often yielded lucrative returns. His network of couriers, droids, and rogue captains became essential for Phoenix Cell and other groups. Vizago's crew moved coded crates filled with Kyber power regulators and shield emitters hidden beneath produce and scrap metal. They smuggled communications relays disguised as cargo containers. They transported Fulcrum agents to rendezvous points while faking customs records. In return, Vizago demanded favors: protection from rival cartels, access to restricted zones, and the occasional bribe. It was a delicate relationship, but one that worked. The rebellion, for all its ideals, needed scoundrels just as much as it needed heroes. Meanwhile, in the dark halls of Imperial intelligence, a threat began to take form. Not to the galaxy, but to the hidden war itself. Grand Admiral Thrawn, recently promoted and already feared for his tactical genius, began tracking the movements of cells like Phoenix Squadron with cold, calculating interest. Thrawn, a Chiss outsider among the Imperial elite, approached warfare as an art. He studied culture, language, patterns. Where others saw chaos, he saw intention. It was Thrawn who first deduced that these isolated strikes were not coincidental. While other Imperial officers dismissed the Phoenix Cell as a nuisance, Thrawn recognized their coordination. He analyzed Fulcrum's messages. Not content, but cadence, syntax, timing. He deduced that a single intelligence source was involved. He began mapping rebel movements with surgical precision, predicting targets not through brute force, but through logic. Thrawn's early encounters with Phoenix Cell forced the rebellion to adapt. Their bases became more transient, their missions shorter and more unpredictable. They abandoned safe houses at the slightest hint of surveillance. Encryption protocols were doubled, then tripled. Still, losses came. Fulcrum operatives were captured, smuggling lanes were intercepted. Commander Sato himself was nearly killed during a failed rendezvous near Maikapo. The cost of secrecy was high, but the alternative was annihilation. Despite Thrawn's pressure, the secret war continued. Cells began forming fallback alliances. Phoenix Squadron aligned with elements of the Spectres, an independent crew operating from the Ghost Starship, composed of ex-Jedi, Mandalorians, and former street thieves. This merging of disparate backgrounds highlighted one of the rebellion's strengths: diversity of thought, culture, and approach. It was messy, but it was alive. Rebel operations grew more sophisticated. Shadow operatives began launching false flags, staging attacks designed to mislead Imperial analysts. Slicers embedded recursive codes into captured data, feeding the Empire information that was plausible, but false. In some cases, Phoenix Cell even allowed minor operatives to be captured with decoy intelligence, sacrificing them to protect larger missions. It was cruel, but effective. And always, Fulcrum coordinated in the background, never present, never identified, yet always a step ahead. Ahsoka Tano's influence reached its peak during this period. Though few ever met her in person, her name carried weight in hushed briefings. Her orders were trusted. Her instincts rarely failed. Even hardened soldiers found themselves pausing before questioning a Fulcrum directive. And yet, Ahsoka knew the danger of her role. She changed protocols constantly, used proxies, and never stayed in one place for more than a cycle. She knew the Empire was closing in, and that if she fell, the entire network might collapse. By the time Phoenix Cell began coordinating openly with the larger rebellion, they had already laid the foundations of an invisible infrastructure: code phrases, encrypted frequencies, extraction teams, informant systems. Their contributions went beyond battles. They had created a way to survive in the shadows, a way to fight a war before the galaxy even knew there was one. And through it all, Thrawn waited. He studied their tactics, adjusted his strategies, and plotted the moment when Phoenix Squadron would overreach. His interest in their methods became obsession. He collected artwork, language patterns, intercepted messages, anything that would give him insight into the minds of his adversaries. His presence forced the hidden cells of the rebellion to evolve, faster, smarter, colder. The secret wars did not have victory parades or dramatic speeches, but they were just as important as the battles that followed. They delayed the Empire, they saved lives, they carried the truth when the Holonet refused to speak it. They proved that rebellion was not born in fire, it was born in whispers. Hidden cells. Shadow operatives, smugglers and slicers. Ahsoka Tano's quiet voice. Jun Sato's steady leadership. All these threads, fragile and scattered, were being woven into something greater. The Empire had yet to realize it, but the secret war had already lit a fuse. And the flame was growing. Chapter 5. Mon Cala Uprising. Beneath the roiling oceans of Mon Cala lay a world of vibrant life, ancient cities, and an enduring spirit of independence. The Mon Calamari people, graceful, brilliant, and stubbornly proud, had built their civilization among towering coral metropolises and deep abyssal research platforms long before they ever encountered the wider galaxy. When the Republic came calling, they welcomed cooperation. When the Empire arrived, they resisted. What happened on Mon Cala would shift the course of the rebellion forever, not in the name of ideology or politics, but because the Empire made the fatal mistake of trying to break a world that refused to kneel. At the end of the Clone Wars, Mon Cala had been a loyal member of the Republic. Its young monarch, King Lichar, had earned galactic respect after leading his people through the Separatist invasion during the war. A compassionate ruler, Lichar believed in diplomacy and coexistence, even as the tides of galactic politics turned dark. He maintained Mon Cala's autonomy under imperial rule for a time, hoping that cooperation would shield his world from the harsher hand of oppression that gripped so many others. But the Empire did not forget Mon Cala's defiance during the war, nor did it trust a planet that possessed both strategic shipyards and a native population that had once openly resisted tyranny. Lichar's attempts to negotiate peace only delayed the inevitable. Imperial governors, backed by stormtrooper garrisons and deep-sea probe droids, began tightening their hold. They imposed tariffs, took control of the shipyards, and installed a network of surveillance stations both above and below the waves. Protests flared, then riots. The king was forced to act, even as his advisors urged caution. In the end, his caution cost him his life. The assassination of King Lichar was a quiet affair. Official imperial reports cited an accident. His personal transport malfunctioned and sank beyond recovery during a diplomatic tour of the deep trenches. But witnesses spoke of sabotage, of an imperial escort diverging from standard flight paths, of TIE repulsor lifts circling the crash site minutes before the tragedy. Lichar's body was never recovered, and the investigation closed with chilling efficiency. Across Mon Cala, few believed the official story. The king was gone, and in his place came full military occupation. The Quarren, Mon Cala's sister species and historical rivals, had been divided on the issue of resistance. Some among them saw opportunity in cooperating with the Empire, seeking favor and power, but after the king's death, even those factions began to question the price of collaboration. Entire districts were sealed off. Royal guards were arrested, surveillance deepened. Mon Calamari engineers were forced to work under watchful eyes, constructing Star Destroyer components and orbital defenses for their oppressors. The Empire believed that the world would submit in time, that fear would drown dissent. They were wrong. In the kelp forests and sea caverns, resistance simmered, and in orbit, two figures prepared to change the fate of their people and the future of the rebellion. Admiral Raddus, a firebrand tactician known for his decisive action and fierce pride, had been a close confidant of King Lichar. Once commander of Mon Cala's planetary defense fleet, he had been stripped of his rank under imperial reforms and relegated to a ceremonial post. But Raddus was no passive servant. He began organizing a shadow fleet, hidden vessels, retrofitted cruisers, and converted civilian transports kept in reserve far from the prying censors of the Empire. He recruited loyalists, trained ex-naval personnel in secret, and slowly prepared for the day when Mon Cala would rise. Admiral Akbar, meanwhile, worked within the system, outwardly serving the Empire as a military advisor, but secretly documenting their weaknesses, internal divisions and vulnerabilities. He used his position to shield key engineers from conscription, protect sensitive technologies, and feed intelligence to the burgeoning rebel movement through encrypted pulses hidden in standard communication bursts. While Raddus built the fleet, Akbar built the case. Together they represented the two halves of Mon Calamari defiance, Raddus the spear, Akbar the shield. The turning point came when an imperial deep-sea refinery exploded under mysterious circumstances, killing dozens of imperial personnel. The Empire blamed Mon Calamari separatists. In truth, it had been a Quarren saboteur acting alone, mourning the death of his brother in a previous crackdown. The Empire, as always, responded with overwhelming force. They began rounding up suspects indiscriminately, seizing entire districts and placing them under martial law. Executions followed. Cities were flooded with off-world stormtroopers. Orbital command posts began transmitting relocation orders for dissenters. It was not an investigation, it was a purge. At that moment, Admiral Raddus made his move. He broadcast a single message across encrypted planetary channels. The time has come. It was not poetry, but it was enough. His hidden fleet broke orbit in a surprise maneuver, disabling several Imperial listening posts and destroying a tractor array meant to prevent orbital departure. At the same time, Akbar triggered a coordinated mutiny across the shipyards. Engineers and sympathetic security officers sabotaged the docking clamps holding Mon Calamari cruisers in place. Backup systems were disabled. Explosive charges ruptured dry dock connections. What had been tools of Imperial production suddenly became vessels of liberation. The Battle of Mon Cala was short and chaotic. The Empire, caught off guard, scrambled fighters and frigates to stop the escape, but the rebel fleet, comprised of homeworld capital ships, escape transports, and even modified mining vessels, pushed through. Several ships were lost. Others sacrificed themselves to shield the escape of the larger cruisers. But when the dust cleared, nearly half of Mon Cala's remaining fleet had broken through the blockade and jumped to hyperspace. The Mon Calamari fleet had joined the rebellion. Their arrival was seismic. Until then, the rebellion had fought primarily with converted freighters, stolen corvettes, and small fighter squadrons. Mon Cala brought star cruisers, heavy capital ships capable of going toe-to-toe with Imperial-class destroyers. Their technology, sleek, organic, and modular, allowed for extensive customization. Each cruiser was a symbol of defiance, designed not for conquest but survival and retaliation. The MC-75 Profundity, later commanded by Admiral Raddus himself, became a flagship of the Alliance. The MC-80 Home 1, eventually helmed by Admiral Akbar, would become the center of rebel naval strategy during the Galactic Civil War. Mon Calamari engineers, driven by a sense of purpose and vengeance, became essential to the Alliance's shipbuilding operations. Hidden shipyards were established in isolated regions, Polis Massa, Telaris, and others, where Mon Calamari laborers worked under tight secrecy. Their vassals often bore no serial numbers. Their communication systems were encrypted with code cycles unique to their species. They transformed civilian freighters into gunships, passenger liners into stealth platforms. And they did it with discipline born from generations of survival beneath the pressure of their homeworld's oceans. What made the Mon Calamari fleet so formidable was not just the ships, but the people who manned them. Raddus and Akbar instilled a sense of purpose in every crew member. They understood the cost of rebellion because they had lived it. They had watched their cities burn, their monarch assassinated, their culture targeted. Their fight was not for political points or sector control. It was personal. Within the ranks of the rebellion, the Mon Cala were admired for their bravery and professionalism. Their presence gave legitimacy to the rebel cause. For many neutral systems sitting on the fence, the participation of an entire species and the escape of an entire fleet proved that the rebellion was not merely a band of extremists, but a rising force worthy of support. The Empire, stung by its failure to prevent the exodus, retaliated against Mon Cala with vengeance. The planet was locked down, its oceans patrolled by heavy cruisers. The Imperial government installed a Quarren-controlled puppet council backed by stormtrooper garrisons. The seas were seeded with mines, trade was cut off, cultural sites were desecrated. The world became a cautionary tale used by the Empire. This is what rebellion brings. But in truth, Mon Cala had already won. Their fleet gave the rebellion teeth. Their shipyards became sanctuaries. Their leaders would help shape the future of the war. Raddus would die a hero above Scarif, leading the assault that delivered the Death Star plans. Akbar would live to fight in the Battle of Endor, launching the strike that would end the Emperor's reign. Their legacy, born from the deep, would echo across the stars. The rebellion owed many debts, but few as great as the one owed to the oceans of Mon Mothma. Without their uprising, the Alliance might have remained a scattered insurgency. With their ships, it became a force capable of challenging the Empire in open war. It began with the murder of a king. It ended with a fleet emerging from the depths, carrying with it the hope of a galaxy. Chapter 6. The Shadow of the Inquisitorius. When the Jedi Temple fell and Order 66 echoed across the stars, the Empire did not simply erase a generation of Guardians, it severed the galaxy's connection to its conscience. The Jedi had been the living embodiment of peace and purpose, their ancient order a stabilizing force, even in the chaos of war. Their fall was as much psychological as it was strategic, and the void they left behind became fertile ground for fear, doubt, and submission. But the Empire knew fear was not enough. Some Jedi had survived, and so it created a weapon of silence, the Inquisitorius. Officially, the Inquisitorius did not exist. There were no Imperial press releases, no holonet announcements. It operated in shadow, its members unnamed in public records, their actions unclaimed even by the Emperor himself. But the damage they wrought was unmistakable. Where whispers of Jedi survival emerged, Inquisitors followed. Where a child displayed strange abilities, that child vanished. Where rebel operatives spoke of unseen defenders or mysterious sabers in the dark, Imperial silence was quickly followed by blood. The Grand Inquisitor, once a Jedi Temple guard now warped by betrayal and the dark side, was the first and most infamous of their kind. Tall, cold, and calculating, he viewed surviving Jedi not as enemies, but as echoes to be silenced. He knew their teachings, their tactics, their weaknesses. He did not hate them. He extinguished them like a scholar correcting an error. To him, Order 66 had not finished the purge. It had merely opened the hunt. His operations were surgical. On remote outposts like Radnor, Arcanis, and Lothal, he appeared without warning. Rebel cells who had never seen a lightsaber outside of myth were suddenly watching comrades lifted into the air, choked or burned or sliced down in complete silence. The Inquisitor did not interrogate. He extracted, and he left messages, carved sigils into walls, burnt corridors, a single white-hot slash through metal bulkheads. Always the same outcome: fear. One of the Empire's cruelest tactics emerged from the case of Jedi Master Luminara Unduli. Captured in the final days of the Clone Wars, she had not been executed outright. Instead, the Empire used her corpse as a trap. Preserved, seated, and restrained within a containment pod aboard a high-security prison complex on Stygian Prime. Through the Force, faint remnants of her essence lingered, manipulated and projected by dark technologies to lure survivors and Force sensitives out of hiding. The pod was presented as a sign: Luminara lived, come find her, and many tried. None escaped. Rebel intelligence eventually uncovered the truth, and the story became a quiet lesson passed among Fulcrum agents and Jedi sympathizers alike: trust nothing the Empire offers. If even a revered master could be weaponized after death, then no hope could be taken at face value. The tactic worked. Recruits began second-guessing reports of Jedi appearances, afraid that they too would walk into a trap. But, as with all tools of terror, the strategy had an unintended side effect. It confirmed that Jedi did still exist. If the Empire was hunting them, then some must have survived. And that idea, however faint, became a seed of defiance. On the backwater world of Lothal, far from the Senate and deep in Imperial industrial territory, a former Jedi named Kanan Jarrus had survived the purge by hiding in plain sight. Once known as Caleb Doom, he had shed the robes, buried the lightsaber, and lived as a smuggler, drinker, and drifter. He had no interest in the rebellion, no trust in causes or orders, but Lothal changed him. Or rather, a boy did. Ezra Bridger, a Force Centaur orphan scraping by on the streets of Capital City, stumbled into Kanan's life during a mission involving the Spectres, a rebel crew operating out of a heavily modified freighter called the Ghost. What began as coincidence became destiny. Kanan took Ezra as his Padawan, reluctantly at first, then with a sense of rediscovered purpose. In the ruins of the Jedi Order, a new bond was forged, and for the first time in years, a Jedi was not alone. Their presence on Lothal did not go unnoticed. The Grand Inquisitor was dispatched, drawn not just by the Jedi signatures, but by the increased activity of Phoenix Cell and Fulcrum agents operating in the sector. Lothal, with its TIE Defender project and Kyber crystal shipments, was of strategic importance to the Empire. It became a proving ground, not only for the rebellion's courage, but for the Empire's cruelty. What followed was a psychological siege. The Grand Inquisitor pursued Kanan and Ezra relentlessly, not just in combat, but in philosophy. He taunted Kanan's failures, exploited Ezra's doubts, and hunted them across moons and ruins and starships. Each confrontation was more than a fight. It was a test of identity. Were the Jedi extinct? Could they still matter? Kanan's answer, forged in battle and sacrifice, was yes. He would not run, and in standing his ground, he gave the rebellion a symbol. The impact of Jedi sightings, even unconfirmed, rippled across rebel networks. Stories spread of blue sabers igniting in Imperial corridors, of masked hunters repelled by cloaked figures. Hollow recordings, blurred and unstable, circulated through Fulcrum channels. To many rebel recruits, the Jedi were more than myth. They were proof that the Empire had not broken everything, that justice, however battered, still breathed. But for every tale of Jedi defiance, there were 10 of the Inquisitorius. More Inquisitors emerged, each given numeric designations and trained in brutal simplicity. The fifth brother, slow and merciless; the seventh sister, cunning and manipulative; the eighth brother, a hunter of hunters. Each wielded lightsabers of spinning crimson, each driven by a dark echo of the Force, each consumed by the task of extinguishing hope. They did not merely kill Jedi, they broke them. Civilians caught harboring Force-sensitives were executed. Force-sensitive children were taken and never seen again. Rebel cells who reported unusual phenomena often found themselves ambushed within days. Inquisitors did not act like stormtroopers. They did not demand compliance. They did not ask questions. They arrived, destroyed, and vanished. The psychological effect was profound. Rebel commanders began drafting contingency plans for Force incidents. Cells with rumored Jedi connections were isolated. Some groups refused to work with anyone suspected of being a Force user, believing it drew unwanted attention. Even Fulcrum agents, normally calm under pressure, treated reports of Jedi sightings with grave caution. The shadow of the Inquisitorius was long and cold, and yet hope persisted. Ezra Bridger became more than a student, he became a symbol. Young, brave, imperfect and determined, he represented a new generation not bound by the Jedi Code but inspired by its ideals. Under Kanan's guidance, he unlocked his potential, connected with ancient temples, communed with the Force in ways even the Old Order never fully understood. His journey reminded the rebellion that the Force was not dead, that it could still rise, even in the dark. Kanan Jarrus, for his part, evolved from a survivor into a teacher, a leader, and ultimately, a martyr. His sacrifice on Lothal to save his crew and cripple the Empire's local operations became legend within rebel circles. A single Jedi, long thought lost, had held back the tide with nothing but courage and purpose. The Inquisitorius had failed to destroy him, and in that failure they had exposed a truth. The Jedi, while few, were not gone. The Inquisitorius continued its hunt, but the tides had shifted. Their presence no longer inspired only fear. It inspired resistance. civilians began protecting known Force sensitives, smuggling them away from Imperial patrols. Underground temples were uncovered and studied by rebel mystics. Force-related artifacts once considered dangerous were now preserved and hidden in rebel vaults. The Force had returned to the battlefield, not as a weapon, but as a whisper of destiny. The Grand Inquisitor's own end was symbolic, defeated not by overwhelming power but by the resilience of two Jedi standing together. He chose death over capture, plunging into the fire he had so often used to purge others. His final act was one of control, not redemption, but it echoed the futility of the Empire's war on faith. One could kill Jedi, destroy temples, and silence believers, but one could not kill belief. In the years that followed, the Inquisitorius faded, their ranks thinned, their authority diminished. The Empire, stretched thin by open war, could no longer afford to maintain its secret order of assassins. Some Inquisitors vanished, going rogue. Others were killed by their prey. A few, like the Second Sister, fell in internal power struggles. In time, Darth Vader himself became the final hunter, less patient, more brutal, but equally relentless. But by then, the damage had been done. The Inquisitorius had failed to snuff out the light. Jedi like Cal Kestis, Ahsoka Tano, and Ezra Bridger continued their paths, and the rebellion, once afraid to even whisper the word Jedi, now openly sought their guidance. The Empire had built the Inquisitorius to inspire terror. Instead, it proved that the Force could not be silenced. Chapter 7. From Smugglers to Sympathizers. For every explosion that echoed across a battlefield, at every starfighter that screamed into combat, 1,000 quieter acts of rebellion unfolded in shadows, unnoticed, unglorified, and essential. The rebellion was never won solely by fleets or Jedi or senators with grand speeches. It was won too in back alleys and hidden ports, in hushed conversations and corrupted data ports, by smugglers, slicers, and saboteurs who operated in the grey between loyalty and survival. It was here, in the underworld and the overlooked, that the rebellion gained momentum, not through might, but through the silent shifting of the galaxy's weight. Nowhere was that weight more unpredictable than in Hutt space. The Hutt cartel had long played a game of neutrality, masquerading as sovereignty. Sprawling across the outer rim, their reach extended over countless systems, most of them governed not by law but by tribute, fear, and favor. Nar Shaddaa, Nal Hutta, Sleheron, Toydaria, these worlds operated under the crime lord's gaze, and the Empire, for all its arrogance, rarely dared to enforce full control within them. Stormtroopers might be feared across the core, but on Nar Shaddaa it was the Hutt's enforcers, Trandoshan bounty hunters, Gamorrean bruisers, and cyber-enhanced assassins that dictated order. To the Hutts, both the Empire and the Rebellion were disruptions to business. But as the Empire's grip tightened, disrupting supply routes, enforcing embargoes, and installing puppet governors in outlying sectors, even the cartels began to chafe. Bribes no longer guaranteed safe passage. Entire syndicates were liquidated under vague charges of sedition. When Black Sun's operations on Mustafar were dismantled by a surprise Imperial raid, it sent a message to every underworld boss. The Empire no longer respected the rules of engagement. It was then that quiet deals began to shift. While the Hutts never publicly aligned with the rebellion, they had too much to lose, they opened their networks to rebel agents. Smugglers began carrying more than spice and slaves. Hidden among contraband were data drives, medical supplies, and even weapons. Ships that had once run jobs for the cartel now disappeared into hyperspace with rebel cargo, their manifests forged, their crews paid in untraceable currencies. The rebellion's logistics web, so often strained by blockade and scarcity, found unexpected lifelines in places like Nar Shaddaa's Smuggler's Moon and the moons of Nal Hutta. Nowhere was the line between outlaw and freedom fighter blurrier than in the Free Ryloth movement. Led by Cham Syndulla, a veteran of the Clone Wars and father to future rebel pilot Hera Syndulla, the Free Ryloth movement had resisted tyranny before most in the galaxy even knew it had returned. Cham's hatred of occupation was not theoretical, it was lived. He had fought against the Separatists, only to see the Republic he bled for morph into a worse enemy. The Empire occupied Ryloth under the guise of peacekeeping, strip-mining its resources and enslaving its people. Cham, betrayed and weary, took up arms once more. The Alliance did not approach Cham lightly. He distrusted galactic politics and saw in the rebellion the same weakness he had once seen in the Senate. Endless debate, too slow to act. But Hera's influence, along with intermediaries from Phoenix Cell, began to change that. Gradually, Cham's forces began sharing intelligence, providing safe havens for rebel crews, and coordinating sabotage missions against Imperial fuel depots and supply convoys. His deep knowledge of guerrilla tactics, honed in Ryloth's dense canyons and vapor fields, was passed to fledgling insurgents across the Outer Rim. But it wasn't just veteran fighters and rogue cartels fueling the rebellion's underground growth, it was also the Slicers. Slicers were the information architects of the rebellion. Neither soldier nor spy, they infiltrated the Empire's endless data streams, decrypting secure transmissions, altering star charts, and rerouting cargo orders to rebel caches. Many operated solo, their true identities unknown even to their rebel contacts. Others formed loosely knit cells, with names like Grid Shadow, Deep Trace, or the Second Circuit. From backwater holonet relays and reprogrammed transmitters in old separatist bunkers, they sabotaged the Empire with a few keystrokes. Among them was the notorious slicer known as Pale Fire, believed to be a former Imperial communications technician from Eriadu. Pale Fire inserted false work orders into construction sites, redirected supply shipments, and once, famously, replaced an entire day's worth of Imperial fleet communications with a broadcast of Mon Mothma's hidden speeches. No one knew their face, only their trail of digital chaos. These slicers were often supported by another class of rebels, defectors. Not every Imperial officer believed in the regime. Some defected out of conscience, others out of desperation. Engineers from Kuat drive yards who questioned why their blueprints were being retrofitted for planetary destruction. Medical officers from Gerrera who saw patients tortured for disobedience. Technicians from Sinar Systems who realized their prototypes were being weaponized against civilians. These ex-Imperials provided knowledge, access codes, and insight the rebellion desperately needed. They knew the back doors in command protocols. They understood ship layouts and maintenance cycles. Some were welcomed warmly, others were watched with suspicion for years. But their value was undeniable. It was because of one such defector, codenamed Echo, that the rebellion first discovered the vulnerability in the TIE Defender's overcharged reactor core, a flaw later exploited during a battle above Lothal. Among the most critical operations supported by these shadow operatives was the rise of a group known as the Shadow Runners. The Shadow Runners were an elite rebel cell specializing in the infiltration and disruption of Imperial supply chains. They didn't just sabotage transports, they embedded themselves within them, disguised as factory workers, port officials, or droid technicians. They would spend weeks inside facilities gathering intel, subtly rerouting components, and sometimes altering production lines so that key shipments would fail inspection and be delayed by weeks. One infamous operation on Balmora saw Shadowrunners alter the code of assembly droids so that every third blaster rifle they produced had a misaligned power cell. Defective, but undetectable until fired in combat. They rarely used names. Their operations were classified under Fulcrum oversight. They left behind symbols, a stylized black gear etched into walls or burned onto crates, reminders that the Empire's machinery could be turned against itself. They were ghosts in the machine. Nowhere did this covert war become more personal than on Corellia and Sullust. Corellia, one of the galaxy's major shipbuilding hubs, had long walked a fine line between loyalty and resistance. The Empire relied on its shipyards for TIE fighters and bulk cruisers, but Corellian independence was ingrained deep in its culture. The Corellian Engineering Corporation was heavily monitored, its employees watched, but that did not stop quiet sabotage from taking root. Engineers embedded within the corporation began altering flight regulators, planting tracking beacons on outgoing ships, and rerouting surplus components to rebel-friendly black markets. Some even faked the destruction of certain cruisers, reporting accidental launches or transport losses, only for those vessels to resurface months later in rebel fleets painted anew. Sullust, home to volcanic caverns and the Sorrow Sub Corporation, became an unlikely rebel foothold. Though Sorrow Sub initially collaborated with the Empire, internal resistance grew as conscription and corporate oversight intensified. The Sullustans, small, big-aimed beings with a strong sense of community, began organizing quietly. Entire factory levels became rebel cells. Shift leaders falsified output reports to smuggle blasters out in waste containers. Technical schematics were copied onto memory spikes and passed to off-world agents during cargo exchanges. When Sorrow Sub's board eventually pledged loyalty to the Alliance, it was merely the public culmination of years of secret work already in motion. These quiet revolutions didn't make headlines. They didn't end battles, but they ensured the rebellion could fight those battles in the first place. The truth is, every torpedo launched from an X-wing, every stealth drop from a corvette, every encrypted briefing delivered to a command center, it all existed because someone, somewhere in the shadows, took a risk. A slicer faking credentials, a smuggler slipping past a blockade, a factory worker slipping a component into a trash bin. These acts, as small as they seemed, were the foundation of galactic insurrection. Smugglers, sympathizers, defectors, slicers, shadow runners, they were not the faces carved into statues. They were not remembered by name, but they carried the rebellion on their backs. While the Senate debated and starships clashed, the true heart of the rebellion beat in secret, and it beat loud. Chapter 8. Operation Warhammer. Before the rebellion had its navy, its flag, or its formal councils, it had fire. The flame was scattered across dozens of worlds, flickering in isolated cells and burning behind the eyes of desperate freedom fighters. But it wasn't until Operation Warhammer that the rebellion proved it could strike with coordination, force, and vision. It was a mission that did more than wound the Empire. It made the galaxy take notice. It was messy, chaotic, and costly, but it was real. It was war. The target was an Imperial depot on Shantipole, a mountainous, storm-shrouded world tucked away in the Roche sector, mostly forgotten by the Corps. The facility, officially designated RS-221B, was no ordinary garrison. It served as a regional logistics hub, processing high-density fuel, TIE fighter components, and encrypted communiques for 3 nearby sectors. It was well defended, nestled in a high-altitude plateau, protected by automated turbolaser batteries, a ground garrison, and a constantly rotating patrol of TIEs. But it had one critical flaw. It was overconfident. The Massacre group, named for the ancient ruins on Yavin 4 where many of its members would later operate, had identified RS-221B as a keystone target. Founded by General Jan de Donner and Commander Davids Draven, the Massacre group specialized in precision strikes with minimal resources. They weren't a traditional military outfit. They were saboteurs, pilots, and former commandos, many of them veterans of the Clone Wars or defectors from the Imperial Navy. The planning took weeks, facilitated through Fulcrum channels, and coordinated via encrypted bursts through relay nodes scattered across the mid-rim. The team included over 30 operatives drawn from different cells, including a young pilot named Ahu Nara, slicer support from Grid Shadow, and airstrike support from the fledgling Red Squadron. But the linchpin of the plan rested on an audacious tactic. They would use the Empire's own ships against it. Stolen TIE fighters, procured through backroom deals on Corellia and a hijacked transport convoy near Sullus, were stripped, repainted and outfitted with Rebel transponders. Rebel pilots trained extensively in their cramped cockpits, learning to mimic Imperial radio chatter, flight patterns and call and response protocols. These mock drills often ended in frustration. The TIEs were notoriously fragile, lacked shields and had poor visibility, but for this mission they offered the perfect camouflage. The plan was simple in theory: insert a strike team disguised as a returning TIE patrol, land within the depot under false pretenses, sabotage the fuel processing center and communications array from inside, then exfiltrate during the resulting chaos while Red Squadron provided cover. But no plan survives first contact, and Operation Warhammer would be no exception. The first phase went surprisingly well. The 4 stolen TIEs, called Assign Black 1 through 4, descended through Shantipol's violent storm layers just after local shift change, when base security was known to be groggy and distracted. Their forged credentials held long enough to clear the outer perimeter. 2 of the TIEs landed in the forward hangar, while the other 2 circled above, transmitting fabricated reports of a skirmish with pirate vessels near the Roche asteroid belt. The infiltration team, hidden in hollowed-out fuel compartments within one of the landing TIEs, emerged with stealth gear and quickly moved to sabotage the depot's reactor cooling arrays. Meanwhile, grid shadow slicers, inserted days earlier as refugee tech laborers, disabled the internal security cameras and rerouted droid patrols. For 15 glorious minutes, everything went perfectly. Then came the alarm. One of the base's customs officers, a lieutenant with a penchant for rule-following, noticed a slight discrepancy in the registry data of Black 3. Its exhaust patterns didn't match those recorded in the previous mission logs. He flagged it. The Empire responded with efficiency only tyranny could produce. Within 90 seconds, the hangar lockdown was triggered. Within 2 minutes, the stormtroopers were en route. The rebellion's window closed, and the shooting began. What followed was controlled chaos. Explosives planted in the fuel silo detonated prematurely as the infiltration team scrambled to escape, creating a chain reaction that destroyed over a third of the depot's fuel stores. Shockwaves rippled across the plateau, throwing stormtroopers and saboteurs alike to the ground. A communications tower buckled, crashing into the main barracks. Emergency klaxons howled through the smoke. Red Squadron entered the fray seconds later, bursting from the clouds in retrofitted Y-wings and X-wings that still bore mismatched plating and exposed wires. They strafed the base's anti-air emplacements while coordinating a distraction run over the southern ridgeline, drawing half the TIE response force away from the depot. But it was a slaughter. The stolen TIEs were shot down before they could lift off again. 2 Y-wings were destroyed by ground-based flak. The infiltration team suffered nearly 50% casualties during the retreat. Commander Draven himself was nearly captured before detonating a thermal charge and disappearing into the storm with a wounded pilot over his shoulder. By the time the rebellion disengaged and leapt into hyperspace from the edge of the Roche sector, they had lost 15 operatives, 6 starfighters, and one of their best infiltration slicers. But they had destroyed the depot. The explosion of RS-221B was visible from orbit, a blue-white inferno that lit up the dark side of the planet like a dying star. Imperial response forces arrived within hours, too late to salvage anything. Fuel caches were incinerated, encrypted data cores were slagged, and the chain of command was shattered. The rebellion had landed its first serious blow to a hardened military installation. It had gone toe-to-toe with the Empire and left a mark. The Galactic reaction was immediate. Imperial news outlets attempted to downplay the incident, referring to it as a containment breach or an industrial mishap caused by poor maintenance. But independent broadcasts and slicer networks spread the truth. Images of the burning depot captured from high-orbit drones and leaked by undercover operatives began circulating through the Free Voice of the Rim and pirate signals in Hutt space. A new name entered the galactic lexicon: Warhammer. Propaganda ministers within the rebellion seized the opportunity. Posters depicting the silhouette of a burning tie above the words "Warhammer Falls" began appearing in cantinas and cargo ports. Audio recordings of Red Squadron chatter, heroic, raw, and filled with urgency, were compiled into motivational hollows used to recruit new pilots. A commemorative sigil, the stylized impact ring of a fuel explosion, became a quiet badge of honor among those who had participated. But the cost lingered. Yando Donna, reflecting on the mission in a classified debrief, described Warhammer as a necessary escalation. It had proven that coordinated strikes were possible. It had tested the rebellion's logistics, tactics, and resolve. But it had also drawn blood. Public support grew, but so did scrutiny. The Empire doubled its patrols around key installations. Security clearances were restructured. Several rebel sympathizers inside Imperial supply chains were quietly executed. The net tightened. Warhammer marked a transition in the rebellion's identity. Until then, most cells had operated defensively, focused on sabotage, interception, and extraction. This mission was offensive. It declared in no uncertain terms that the rebellion was ready to take the fight to the Empire. It turned scattered cells into organized squads. It prompted the first joint training drills between Phoenix Cell, the Massacre group, and newer cells forming on Onderon, Kashyyyk, and Terris. It also hardened the rebellion's resolve. Pilots who had flown escort during Warhammer began mentoring new recruits. Survivors of the ground team, scarred but resolute, developed new infiltration protocols. The rebellion was no longer just reactive. It was becoming a force with strategies, targets, and battlefield cohesion. The Empire had forced its hand, and the rebellion had clenched it into a fist. In time, larger battles would follow: Scarif, Hoth, Endor. But for many within the Alliance, Operation Warhammer was where the war truly began. It wasn't the largest victory, it wasn't even the cleanest, but it was proof that the rebellion could bleed the Empire. And it had done so with courage, with sacrifice, and with fire. Chapter 9. The Birth of the Rebel Alliance. Until now, the rebellion had been a current, pulling disparate factions and individuals along a shared path, without formal boundaries. Fighters like Cham Syndulla and Saw Gerrera had carved their own trails through the chaos, while cells like Phoenix Squadron and the Massacre group struck targets on the edge of coordination, often unaware of each other's existence. But currents, however strong, require a confluence to become a river. That convergence arrived in the form of a singular act of defiance, the Declaration of Rebellion. In its words, scattered voices became a cause. In its symbolism, the Alliance was born. The roots of this transformation lay in a single moment of clarity, delivered not in battle, but through a message. Mon Mothma had remained a senator for as long as she could, operating under the thin veneer of diplomacy even as the Empire grew more brutal by the day. But after the Ghorman Massacre, and as the Senate dissolved further into irrelevance, she began to see her presence there not as leverage, but as complicity. The final break came when she received intelligence that the Empire had begun monitoring her communications, even among her own aides. She knew her time within the halls of Coruscant's politics had ended. Her declaration was recorded in secrecy, broadcast across hundreds of pirate networks, slicer loops, and rebel relays. It was simple, elegant, and unwavering in tone. I, Mon Mothma, do hereby resign from the Imperial Senate. I accuse Emperor Palpatine of crimes against the Republic. I call on all who still believe in justice, in peace, in freedom to join me. Let us forge a new path, a rebellion to restore the Republic and reclaim the light we have lost. The impact was immediate. The Empire denounced her as a traitor. Her image was plastered across wanted lists and bounty postings. But the message resonated. It gave the rebellion a face. No longer a mythic Jedi or faceless commando, but a senator, a citizen, someone who had stood within the machine and rejected it publicly. This declaration did more than inspire, it demanded unity, and for that, the rebellion needed structure. Shortly after the message is broadcast, a secret meeting was called. Its location was a calculated risk, Corellia. Long known for its shipyards and fiercely independent culture, Corellia had been walking the line between compliance and rebellion since the Empire's rise. Garm Bel Iblis, Corellian senator, war veteran and longtime dissident, had grown increasingly distant from his counterparts, Mon Mothma and Bail Organa. Where Mothma sought coordination and restraint, Bel Iblis believed in preparation and overwhelming retaliation. He had funded militias and armed private forces for years, always with the belief that the only way to destroy the Empire was through open, total war. Still, he agreed to host the meeting in a repurposed subterranean transport hub beneath the capital city of Coronet. Representatives from Phoenix Cell, the Free Ryloth Movement, the Masasi Group, Fulcrum operatives and several unaffiliated rebel leaders arrived in stages, each under heavy security. Even General Jan Dodonna and Commander Sato attended, via encrypted holofeeds. The summit lasted 3 days. What emerged from those meetings was not perfect agreement, but an agreement to unite. The formal creation of the Alliance to Restore the Republic, commonly shortened to the Rebel Alliance, was ratified in that underground chamber. It was less a government than a council, built from necessity rather than idealism. Mon Mothma was confirmed as civilian leader and chancellor of the Alliance, while a high command was established for military strategy, composed of respected leaders from the major rebel cells. A provisional charter was signed by all attendees, pledging coordinated resistance against the Empire under a single command structure. But one name was missing from the final document: Garm Bel Iblis. Despite his role in making the summit possible, Bel Iblis refused to sign. He feared the centralization of power, distrusted Mon Mothma's idealism, and believed that unification risked weakness. He returned to Corellia, withdrawing his private forces from the main network and continuing the fight independently. Some saw his departure as a blow to rebel strength, others as a necessary parting of ways. He would later return to the fold, years later, during the Thrawn campaigns, but his absence in the early days marked a deep philosophical divide within the rebellion, one between controlled resistance and unrestrained war. The loss of Bel Iblis forced the new alliance to focus even more on logistics and cohesion. Without his private funding and arms routes, the alliance needed to build its infrastructure from scratch. Slissers and sympathizers worked tirelessly to connect the separate cells into a coordinated network. A centralized command protocol was developed, one that could allow individual units to act semi-independently while reporting to regional commanders. Redundancies were built into every system. Secure relay buoys, encrypted code phrases, and rotating call signs ensured that a single compromised cell wouldn't destroy the rest. Funding came from a complex blend of sources: donations from sympathetic planetary leaders like Bail Organa, covert reappropriations from corporate accounts flagged as imperial waste, and black market deals brokered through neutral smugglers. The Hutts never officially supported the alliance, but they tolerated a select few transactions when the price was right. On Chandrila and Alderaan, hidden warehouses were converted into supply caches. On Sullust and Garel, factories were quietly co-opted to produce weapons and shield components. It was a miracle of organization and trust, built on fragile alliances, midnight meetings, and the belief that something greater could be forged from the chaos. From this structure emerged another vital piece of the rebellion: its symbolism. The alliance needed more than function. It needed identity, something that could rally civilians, unify soldiers, and appear on banners, starships, and holos alike. That identity was born in the form of a crest, the Starbird. Based on an ancient Moravian sigil and inspired by the markings painted on the armor of rebel operative Sabine Wren, the Starbird became the official emblem of the Alliance. Stylized and defiant, it represented a rising phoenix, a spark that refused to be snuffed out. The symbol was simple enough to be carved into walls, painted on hulls, or etched into armor. It began appearing everywhere, on datapads, helmets, flags, and tattoos. The Empire banned its display. Rebel sympathizers displayed it all the more. And with identity came formality. Rebellion began issuing ranks, not out of vanity, but necessity. With dozens of cells now coordinating operations, command had to be clear. Mon Mothma approved the creation of military tiers. Commanders, generals, admirals, and specialized unit leaders. Pilots were grouped into squadrons, commanders into regiments, and saboteurs into cells with designated liaisons to high command. Training camps were established in secret locations: forests of Yavin 4, the cliffs of Dantooine, caverns of Crate, where operatives could learn tactics, codes, and battlefield procedure. Former Republic officers wrote handbooks. Veterans like Jan Dodonna developed doctrines for coordinated space assaults. A fleet was forming, not just of ships, but of structure. This professionalization did not come without cost. Some rebel fighters, particularly those from more anarchist cells or partisan remnants, resisted the shift toward military order. They feared bureaucracy, the loss of autonomy, and the risk of recreating the very institutions the Empire had once corrupted. But most accepted it. They understood that if the rebellion wanted to win, not just resist, it had to grow up, and it had to do so quickly. By the end of the following cycle, the Alliance had solidified its logistics across the mid and outer rim. Ships moved supplies between caches with coded routes. Fulcrum agents trained new operatives in the art of information warfare. Fighters and transports began sporting unified paint schemes. The first combined fleet maneuvers were conducted over the planet Anaxis, testing the readiness of multiple squadrons working under a shared command. The rebellion was no longer a movement, it was a force, and yet it remained precarious. Every system was a gamble, every recruit a risk. The Alliance had no capital, no protected territory, no guarantee of survival. Its leaders could be hunted at any moment. But in forging something unified from fragments, the rebellion had passed a threshold. Mon Mothma's declaration had lit the fire. The secret meeting on Corellia had channeled it. The structure, funding, and shared identity that followed gave it the strength to endure. Now, for the first time, the Empire was facing more than saboteurs and insurgents. It was facing an alliance. Chapter 10: Fire Across the Stars. By the time the Alliance to Restore the Republic formally existed, the galaxy was already ablaze. But it was a quiet fire at first. An ember that sparked in remote moons and forgotten sectors. A whisper in the wind rather than the roar of open war. Still, the rebellion endured, evolving from disparate flames into a rising conflagration. The final chapter in its formation before it became legend began not with starfleets clashing in orbit, but with secrets buried inside the Empire's darkest vaults. It began with Stardust. The name was known only to a few. Even within Imperial ranks, Project Stardust was veiled in layers of security, spoken only in cipher and buried under layers of redirection. At first, the rebellion wasn't even sure it was real. Dozens of codenames floated through intercepted communications: Celestial Halo, Mark Omega, Nova Core. All hinted at something vast, something dangerous. But it was Stardust that kept appearing with the highest level of encryption, attached to resource shipments that made no logistical sense, and construction projects hidden in uncharted systems. Rebel intelligence redoubled its efforts. Slicers were deployed across the outer rim. Fulcrum agents went dark for weeks chasing rumors. One such agent, working deep undercover within the Coruscant data archives, first flagged the name Ahsoka, a seemingly unimportant scientist suddenly attached to high-clearance development projects. The name alone wasn't enough. But it started a path, and down that path, new names emerged, names that would soon define the rebellion's future. Cassian Andor had been a rebel long before the Alliance had a name. A child of war, he had grown up during the Clone Wars, fighting in local insurrections and learning early that survival required sacrifice. Recruited into the Massacre group under Commander Draven, Andor was trained as an intelligence operative, saboteur, and assassin. He wasn't the kind of hero that appeared in propaganda hollows. His hands were stained, his orders brutal, but he believed in the cause, in its necessity, and he never flinched from its cost. Cassian had worked in shadow, eliminating informants, destroying weapon depots, sabotaging TIE prototypes, but it was during the hunt for Stardust that he became indispensable. He understood the subtle currents of Imperial bureaucracy, knew when to lean in and when to vanish. His partnership with K2SO, an Imperial security droid reprogrammed by Alliance techs, proved critical. K2, with his blunt demeanor and razor-sharp processors, served not just as a bodyguard and analyst, but as a constant reminder of what the Empire was: cold, calculated, and cruel. Together, they became one of the most effective infiltration units in the rebellion. As the Stardust project remained elusive, the Alliance began to shift. No longer a patchwork insurgency, it became a military force. Squadrons were standardized, strategic command structures solidified. The hidden base on Yavin 4, built within the ancient Massacre temple ruins, became the heartbeat of rebel operations. Supply lines, training grounds, encrypted communication arrays, all coordinated from this sanctuary deep in the jungle moon's core. General Draven, once a shadow figure within the intelligence division, emerged into prominence. A hard-edged strategist known for his moral flexibility, Draven embodied the rebellion's pragmatic face. He understood that the Alliance could not afford to fight cleanly. Victory required ugliness. He authorized assassinations, preemptive strikes, and morally ambiguous missions, often putting him at odds with Mon Mothma and the idealists within high command. But his results were undeniable. Under his watch, intelligence efforts against the Empire surged. It was Draven who authorized the mission to assassinate Galen Erso, the Imperial scientist believed to be central to Project Stardust. It was Cassian who accepted it. But that mission would not go as planned. It would lead instead to a team, small, unapproved, and desperate, led by Galen's daughter, Jyn Erso, on a daring raid to the Imperial data archives on Scarif. But that is another story. What mattered most in the months leading to that moment was transformation. The Alliance was no longer playing defense. It had begun to prepare. Fleet Command had drawn up contingency plans for full-scale engagements. Cells once limited to sabotage were being folded into larger strike forces. Rebel leaders like Admiral Radis began constructing tactical models for coordinated fleet actions. Red and Gold squadrons trained together for the first time. The Alliance began building ships, not just to run, but to fight. Still, secrecy remained their greatest weapon. No world openly declared for the rebellion. Support came in credits wired through obscure merchant banks, in food deliveries labeled as corporate shipments, in starfighter components marked for industrial research. Pilots wore mismatched gear to confuse scanners. Command centers operated on rotating power cycles to avoid long-range detection. Rebel recruiters spoke in riddles, vetting sympathizers through elaborate rituals and cover stories. There were no parades. There was only movement, silence, and trust. And beneath it all, hope. It was an intangible thing, hope. It could not be quantified or measured in fleet tonnage or supply inventories, but it was everywhere. In the graffiti scrawled on undercity walls, in the small rebellions of enslaved laborers, in the distant smile of a farmer watching an Imperial transport crash from sabotage. Hope was rebellion in its most human form. It was contagious, defiant, and more dangerous to the Empire than any torpedo. The price, however, was steep. Every step forward cost lives. Operatives went dark and never returned. Convoys were intercepted. Cells were compromised. Kanan Jarrus, Jedi and mentor, died saving Lothal from Imperial terror. Dozens of young pilots were lost testing experimental hyperdrives. Whole missions vanished into the unknown. The Alliance became practiced in mourning without delay. Heroes died, and the cause moved forward. And yet, despite the darkness, there was unity. When news of the Stardust project reached Yavin 4, its true nature finally exposed as a planet-killing weapon, The Alliance stood at the edge of fracture. Fear gripped the Council. Some called for retreat, for hiding, for waiting, but it was Admiral Raddus, bold and resolute, who declared that action was the only answer. He took his fleet to Scarif, and the Alliance followed. It was that moment when volunteers leapt into battle not for orders but for belief that defined the rebellion. They fought not as scattered cells or isolated heroes, but as one. The Death Star plans were secured. Many died to make that possible, but their sacrifice gave the rebellion its chance. The spark became fire. The fire became a weapon. From that day, the galaxy knew the truth. The rebellion was real. It had a name, a face, a fleet, and it had hope. Fire across the stars.